Hi, welcome back. I hope your time away was wonderful and beautiful and kind, like all the things you can find in the Wiz movie. For those of you that do not know what the Wiz is, I highly recommend you watch it, and because it is a retelling of the Wizard of Oz with an all-black cast with Diana Ross and Michael Jackson and I think it's Richard Pryor and Quincy Jones does all the music. It's a one. It's a phenomenal. It's just watch it. Um, now, today we're going to be talking about POV. When I say POV, point of view, we talked about a little bit about POV and point of view before, and we're going to be talking about it in relation to early autumn. Now, I know you read early autumn last week, or rather, you read it on Friday. You should have read it on Friday, it was in reference to how brief story can be and still have impact. But I'm going to do a lesson because one, this is one of my favorite stories of all time. Two, because this is a story that one of the first stories I read when I learned how to write, or I was taught or began my education rabbit hole into writing. And third, because I don't want you to be reading too much because today your workshop story is due and I don't want to inundate you with too much stuff. Now, this is a story about these two characters. But I want to ask the question: who is this story actually about? Remember, I told you POV is not necessarily first, second, or third person, or rather, it's not just those things. But it's who's telling the story and why they're telling it. And so I asked this question because I'm wondering we're able to dip inside both Bill and Mary's head, but if you look a little closer, we're able to see that it's whose story. I'm going to tell you in about 5 seconds, but I want you to think about it, right? Whose perspective do we start with? Whose perspective do we end with? Whose perspective do you think is prioritized here? And so it is my interpretation that it is Mary's story. And the reason I say that it's Mary's story is that the narrative, if you pay attention, if you not necessarily pay attention, but if you see, the narrative actually never uses the narrator actually never uses Mary's name. So we get Bill's name, right? So in the first sentence, when Bill was very young, they had been in love. And so, and the reason I think that that's a pretty good indication is because when think of all the times you've thought of yourself, and now I want you to think how many times you've thought your name to yourself, right? And not jokingly, like I say sometimes, Matthew's hungry, right? But that's joking. But when I think of myself as I, right? And I think of myself as a body moving through the world, and I don't think of my name as I told you all before, right? I don't know if my name is Matthew or Matt to people, but I just think of myself as he is doing a thing, and so, or rather, I am doing a thing. And so, if I'm in third person trying to tell this story, I'm thinking that he is doing a thing, right? And so we have marriage in third person trying to tell the story, and so she is doing a thing. She is doing a thing, and Bill, right over there, away from me, away from them, this narrator, is a character in this particular story. We also see, we're inundated within the thoughts of Mary, and we're actually going to come to another reason why I think this is. Now, I want to take a slight turn and talk about the character-driven plot flowchart, which I think is just a wonderful idea. And so I'm going to break down this particular story into each of those categories, right? So the first thing we have is three times as much. Now, I don't know three times as much. Obviously, I didn't write this story. Langston Hughes wrote this story. Let's take a step back for a moment. Langston Hughes. Didn't even realize we didn't even talk about this. I'm sure you've heard of Langston Hughes. And so Langston Hughes is one of the most important and prolific figures in American literature. known as the the poet laureate of the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance being um, a burgeoning and flourishing of Black art and literature that had its epicenter in Harlem during the 1920s. Langston Hughes is most known for being a poet, but we see here that he has written a short story. One of my favorite books is his collection of short stories called The Ways of White Folks. He also was a novelist, writing novels like Not Without Laughter. One of his novels is Not Without Laughter, which is also good. And he wrote, Renaissance, right? So good at all the things. So we think about Michelangelo, right? So like did all the things. The Harlem Renaissance was full of people who did all the things. So Hughes wrote poetry, fiction, nonfiction, plays, librettos, opera, right? Like all these wonderful things. And is possibly coined as, I think, the one of the first people to engage with what we call jazz poetry and jazz literature. Now, Langston Hughes, back to Bill and Mary. Now, so some of the things that I recognize, right, from this particular story is that Mary is older, right? So we see that through the narrative, she left Bill for another man, which I think was very devastating. Impulsively, she had married a man she thought she loved, which is devastating. She's from Ohio. She's unhappy in her marriage. She married a man that she thought she loved. She still loves Bill. And we're going to talk about how we know that in a little bit. And lastly, if maybe this was, my hope is that it was as devastating to you as it was to me. But we get to the end of the story and we find, actually, we'll hold that for when we come to that particular point. Let's talk about her wants and fears based off of this particular thing. So she married a man that she thought she loved, right? So maybe she wants to be in love. We see that she still loves Bill, so it seems like she still wants Bill. She still wants the love that she had with Bill. We see that when she instinctively lifted her face when she saw him after years, lifted her face as if wanting a kiss, right? She still wants him. Maybe she fears she'll never love again. We can see that in what she did at the end, right? And her excitement there, and it's also she seems like she fears she's getting older, which is in line with the fear of never loving again, right? Because as you get older, right, she's fearing that maybe she missed out on the good thing that she had, and what has she? And so she missed out on the only good thing that she had, right? And so let's think about some internal conflicts, right? The internal conflict, separate from Bill, of just being in a marriage a marriage to a man that you don't love, right? What does that do to you? How does that shape, the way that one walks through the world? And so let's introduce Bill. Though she still loves Bill, she is married. Right, she has a husband and 3 kids. This is conflict, and so from that internal conflict, we actually get the external conflict. One of the points of external conflict, interestingly, right? So we actually see this is where the end comes in. That the external conflict is she named her child with her husband after Bill, her ex-lover. Isn't that crazy? I was like, this is devastating. And so it's like, oh, she still loves him. But then I think about the reality that you named another man's child after a lover that you once had. I can't imagine that she told her husband this. And I can only imagine what happens if this man finds out. Now, let's keep that in mind, right? So she's naming this man, she named her child after the man that she used to love. And she invited him to her house. Now we see that they actually never end up, exchanging addresses or contact information. But let's imagine that these things were able to actually come to fruition. Bill comes over with his wife, um, says, "Hi, my name is Bill." Husband says, "Oh, my son's name is Bill too." And he's like, "Oh, cool. Maybe Bill isn't actually thinking about any of the things. Maybe he is, right?" So, and my hope is that maybe Bill has some tact and doesn't say anything. But then the husband gets there, they're in conversation. The husband says, "Well, how do you know Mary?" Right? And Bill might say, Bill, if if he's trying to be courteous and generous and gracious to the husband and doesn't want to whatever, he might say, "Oh, we're friends from we know each other years and years ago," and leave it at that. But if he's being completely truthful, which is not necessarily his not necessarily a bad thing, or like not something that he should try to shy away from, he'll say, "We used to date, we used to be in love." And then the husband says, "My wife, Mary, used to be in love with Bill, and Mary suggested to name my third child Bill." And then people put things together. It's incredible. Anywho, so the external conflict ends up being, right, I'm in love with this man. It comes from, right, as I told you all before, external conflict um, meets internal conflict meets external conflict when a decision is made and acted upon. And so we see this, right, in her naming, right? So a decision she still loves, she's conflicted, right? I still love Bill, but I am married. Um, right? And so the conflict is holding on to the memory of Bill or letting Bill go, right? And so what we actually see is the decision was made to say I'm going to hold on to Bill, and then so the decision was made, and the way that it was acted upon is her naming her child after the love about not letting him go. And then we finally we move into plot, which is how these things are tied together. And so the question of the plot is what happens when she sees Bill for the first time in a while, and the story transpires with them seeing each other at a bus stop. Now, moving into the point of view, so one of the brilliance of the story is how the narrator uses setting not only to illuminate, not only to show what the life, I mean, what's going around them, but also to illuminate how Mary feels, and, uh, and before we get there and after we get there. And so what I mean by that is we have, after married yet? Sure, 2 kids. Oh, she said, right? A great many people went past him through the park, people they didn't know. It was late afternoon, nearly sunset, cold. A great many people passed through them in the park, people they didn't know. We get the past, right? We get the past and what Mary feels like was the love that passed through them. You know, they loved each other. They let people they didn't know get in between them, right? People they didn't know. And so we get Mary's feelings surrounding her being married, right? Him being married. You married yet? Sure. A wife and 2 kids. People pass between them. The wife and 2 kids pass between them. The people in life pass between them, right? Nearly sunset, cold, right? And then we get moving down. The leaves fell slowly from the trees in the square, fell without wind. Autumn dusk, she felt a little sick, right? Fell without wind. What does that mean to you? Right? I'm thinking of thing motionless, falling, right? Lucille and I'd love to have you, right? Just really terrible. But then we move on. Suddenly the lights came on. This is after we love it. You ought to see my kids. He grinned, right? And so suddenly the lights came on up the whole length of Fifth Avenue, chains of misty brilliance in the blue air. Now, why would the narrative shift from cold things, distant things, moving forward and back and forth between us, to the lights on the avenue blurred. Oh, excuse me. Suddenly the lights came on the whole length of chains of misty brilliance in the blue air. Chains of misty brilliance. We now have a sunny spot within this narrative, within Mary. Why? Right? Why do you think she has this misty blue spot? Now, and let's do it in relation to the fact that he brought up kids, right? I have an idea, but I'm gonna let you to try to think through it for a moment. So we see by the end of the piece that Mary named her son after Bill, right? And we see that she was going to try. It says at the last sentence, she remembered she had forgotten to give him her address or to ask him for his or tell him that her youngest boy was named Bill too. She was going to tell him. She was going to try to tell him, right? She was excited. When he mentioned kids, she said, "Oh, my kid." Our kid, sort of, maybe. I don't know. Not our kid as in they cheated together, but our kid. I am excited to name a child. I'm excited to tell you about this child, right? And so we get that. Sorry, my cat is doing things, and I'm like trying to figure out if I need to address it or not. I'm gonna keep going, and my hope is that she'll calm down or stop doing anything or whatever. I don't know. I'm gonna go get her actually because I don't know what she's doing. Just a minute. Okay, goodness gracious. All right, so we come down. Let's move along. Now we're gonna move to Genus Narcissus, which is also one of my favorite poems, um, ever. Genus Narcissus is by Natasha Trethewey. Natasha Trethewey is a poet from Mississippi, um, and she is her collection Native Guard won the Pulitzer Prize, and she is a two-time poet laureate of the United States. And just an all-around beautiful person and beautiful woman. She's incredible. I love her very much. I love this poem because it's full of such wonderful imagery. Every sentence, if you take a look, let's see. Every sentence, if you take a look, is an image. And when I say it is an image, you can draw these things out and give it a shot. Maybe you'll if you want to, draw it out. The road I walked home from school was dense with trees and shadow, creekside, and lit by yellow daffodils, early blossoms, bright against winter's last gray days. Right? Like, we can draw that. I think it's so beautiful. And as I told you all before, right, like each line can be taken out, right? The hope is that each line can be taken out and it can stand alone. And I think one of the genius things about this poem is that each line actually is an image. The road I walked home from school, you can draw a road, was dense with trees and shadow, creekside. And the beautiful thing about it is that the images compound each other. So they just, you can draw a road coming away from a school in the first line. The second one, dense with trees and shadow, creekside. You can draw trees and a shadow in creekside, but you can also add it to the road and lit by yellow daffodils, early blossoms. You can draw this, right? You can draw yellow daffodils right before they fully come to bloom, right against winter's last gray days. So we see, we have these really, really beautiful images. Also, if you know, if you know anything about the Tale of Narcissus, right? So one of the things was one of the beautiful things I must have seen in them some measure of myself. The slender stems, each blossom, a head lifted up toward praise or bowed to meet its reflection. Walking home those years ago, I knew nothing of Narcissus or the daffodil's short spring. Do you know anything about Narcissus? All right, Narcissus is a Greek mythological figure. He was incredibly beautiful. he was so beautiful that people were always throwing themselves at him, and he was incredibly vain, which is where we get the term narcissistic from. He was very into himself, so much so that he hated people that loved him so much for whatever reason. And then he so the is a nymph Echo. Echo was following him. He said, "Who's there?" Um, and she said she repeated back, "Who's there?" And she tried to come and embrace him, and he rebuffed her. Like he was like, "Nah, I'm good." To which she went away and was and frustrated for the rest of her life. And in the myth goes, she was so heartbroken by his turning away from her that she went away in life, and she went away and sulked the whole time, and until what was the only thing was left with her was an echo. And so hearing that, so having found this out, the what is it, Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, frustrated with this, was going to punish him. And so what she did was, he was thirsty. He was a hunter, and so he was thirsty after going through from a hunt or something like that. And she lured him into a pool of water, to which he found his reflection, fell instantly in love with his reflection, and not realizing that it was his reflection at first. Not entirely sure how. I don't necessarily know if they have mirrors or not. I don't know if mirrors are a contemporary thing or not, but we're neither here nor there. And once he recognized that it was him, frustrated that he could never have the object of his true love, which is himself, and never, he commits suicide. And so what we get in this poem, which I think is very, very, very good, or actually before we move on, that's one of the ways the myth goes. The other way the myth goes is that, again, he sees his reflection, is frustrated, and is so sorrowful that he can't have the true object of his love, which is himself. He turns and he like melts away somehow, and all that is left of his figure is the daffodil, which is what the daffodil is named after, which is genus Narcissus. Now, one of the wonderful things about this poem, if you so with that being said, paying attention to this sentence, I must have seen in them some measure of myself. First of all, seen in them, right? See in some measure of myself. The myth of Narcissus, as the slender stems, each blossom a head lifted up toward praise. All of these people always praise Narcissus and his beauty, or bowed to meet its reflection. Bowed to meet its reflection. Narcissus was looking into the pool, into his reflection. Just so many layers to this poem that is so incredibly beautiful. Now, with that, we see that this poem is moving into POV, is in the point of view of a little girl. Or is it? And so I asked, or is it? Because we see that the little girl is the person maneuvering through the poem, but we actually see that the poem is retrospective. When I say retrospective, looking back in time, I must have known they grew wild, thought no harm in taking them. I must have seen in them, again, this sentence, I must have seen in them some measure of myself. As if to say, as if to look back and it's just like, I must have seen in them. I don't know what I was doing back then. I must have seen in them some measure of myself. That's the reason I was doing such maybe foolish things, maybe such frivolous things. Not entirely sure. But I think this is one of the again, one of the geniuses of this poem is that we're looking at this particular thing through the lens of the child, but also with some renewed understanding. Now, the end of this poem is also very good. So the turn in this poem, before we get to the end, so we have all these beautiful images of the daffodil, of a young girl proud of herself, right? So a blossom, each blossom a head lifted up, right? Toward praise or bowed to meet its reflection, right? Like these are kind of connoted with positive things. But then we get in the second to last stanza, how they dry like graveside flowers, rustling when the wind blew, a whisper treacherous. We now go into graveside flowers, rustling, treacherous, right? And so what happens here? It says, "Be taken with yourself," they said to me, right? Die early to my mother. Now, a little backstory about Natasha Trethewey is that Natasha, when she was in college, her mother was shot and killed um, by her then husband, so Natasha's stepfather. And so Natasha's poems are, many of Natasha's poems are, thinking about her mother, thinking about memories with her mother, and so on and so forth. And so if you reread the poem, you'll see, she's recounting a beautiful memory with her mother, and then thinking about the story of the daffodil and the story of genus Narcissus. Or Narcissus with regards to this thing, right? So the daffodil says, "Be taken with yourself," as right Narcissus was with himself. They said to me, the girl, "Die early, as Narcissus does," right, to my mother. And I think it's just absolutely beautiful. It's absolutely gorgeous. Um, Now, moving into back into our conversations of love. Speaking of which, I went to a yard sale and I got this book, The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. It's not just a video, and I'm going to read the book and let you all know how I like it. Um, so, what loves do we see here? I think it's fair. We see some in it's fairly obvious what we see in early autumn. Maybe we see a little bit of Eros. Um, how I see a little bit of Storge with regards to the mother and son. A little Eros mixed in with that, which is very very interesting. Unrequited Eros, possibly. What does that? What does that look like? What does that mean? Genus Narcissus is very very interesting to me because not only do we get you can talk about in your discussion what types of love you see, but I also see what's interesting, the love of the self, right? So we have this. I must have been taken by proud of myself, taken with myself. The idea of Narcissus, one who is in love with the self, but also we see the love of the mother, right? The fact that this memory is even being recounted is part of that is part of that love. And so, how do you see? In our to whom is the adoration pointed, right? To oneself, to others, who, what, when, where, and why with regards to that love. I'm not going to give you, so that's all I have for today. I'm not going to give you all an assignment because we have workshop stories to turn in. And I'm so excited to read your work. Your ideas about the published work is so very, very brilliant and beautiful that I'm so ready to engage with your work and to engage with you all. And so until next time, bye-bye. Love you all.